Ποικιλόθρονα θάνατα φρόδιτα, πεδίος δολόπλοκε.
My name is Karen Zeller, and I'm here today to talk about Greek poetry, and particularly the poetry of archaic Greece. Now, if in school you read maybe Antigone, or you have learned a little bit about Greek democracy or Plato, all of that is from a period of Greece we call classical Greek civilization. And archaic Greek civilization is just a little before that. Archaic Greek civilization, the poetry that we're going to talk about today, dates from the period when Greeks first began to relearn how to write down their language. I say relearn because the Greek language goes way back before classical Greek civilization, back to a couple of cultures called the Minoan civilization and the Mycenaean civilization. Both of those cultures date to about 1600 BCE, and in the case of Mycenaeans, continue till about 1100 BCE, the Mycenaean period does. The Mycenaeans inhabited all of what we think of today as Greece, plus a number of areas around the eastern Mediterranean. The Minoans inhabited the island of Crete and a number of nearby islands to there. And they had a highly advanced civilization, developed beautiful, finely crafted artwork. In the case of the Minoans, lots of pottery, lots of wall paintings, advanced architecture. In the case of the Mycenaeans, likewise, similarly advanced architecture in different forms than the Minoans did, and things like the Mask of Agamemnon, of a finely crafted, thin, realistic gold mask, and other works that show a similar level of craftsmanship. So the Mycenaeans and the Minoans both wrote down their language, wrote down the language Greek, and they wrote it in a script called Linear B that took us a long time to be able to decipher. But when we deciphered it, we discovered that it was in fact recording the same language that later Greeks spoke. At some point, though, those Greeks forgot how to write their language, and how that happened is kind of a mystery. Lots of debate about it. One thing we know for sure is that around 1500 there was a huge volcanic explosion, volcanic eruption at a place called Thera, and subsequent to that there were tsunamis, and all of that massively affected Mycenaean civilization, and it kind of destabilized what was happening in the eastern Mediterranean. Mycenaean civilization continued on past that point, but we see in the archaeological record some evidence of the dislocation of peoples beginning soon after the Thera eruption, and continuing with invasions from the north and invasions from the east. There's a period of invasions by the sea peoples who affected civilizations all around the eastern and southern Mediterranean. And eventually, and again, there's mystery to this, how it happens, Mycenaean culture completely breaks down. Mycenaean culture had been built around a series of palaces that controlled the politics of the region, and those palaces were gone. Nobody was writing Linear B anymore by 1100 BC. There had been signs of massive warfare, and we're not entirely clear who was fighting whom. But Mycenaean and Minoan culture went away. And what we had in place of it is what's often called the Greek Dark Ages. And in the Greek Dark Ages, we see a culture that has gone from these beautiful, highly advanced productions of artwork and architecture to styles called proto-geometric, where, yeah, you can make a pot, and what do? You just draw a zigzag on it, because that's as advanced as your artistic culture goes. It's a period of time when nobody's writing anything down. And the Greeks, later on, we can't say they remembered that exactly, but that period, that change is preserved in their culture, because when writing went away, oral poetry remained and became, in fact, more developed over time. So, when Greeks adopted Phoenician alphabet around 800 or so BCE, and began to write down the poetry that they'd been telling each other for a couple of centuries, embedded in that poetry was this sense of a time that came before them, a time when men were greater than they were, when they had this belief that the culture had been far more advanced. So you see a sort of cultural memory in the poetry of an earlier age, of a time that was lost. And I think that that sense of loss drives a lot of what happens in archaic Greek poetry. That sense of loss, I think, is driven not just by the history, but also by the geography. Remember that Greek culture, not only in the Mycenaean and Minoan period, but also all the way into classical period. What we think of Greece today is sort of that glove-shaped map of Greece and the little islands around it. But the Greeks up to the Roman conquest, Greeks would have thought of Greece as being an area that includes what we think of today as Turkey, includes areas to the north of Greece today, areas, all of the islands that go through around Greece and Turkey and Crete. So Greek civilization extended much more widely than we might think of it today. And as people in those regions began to adopt language, as I said, we had this sense of loss, and it is related in part to the geography of those places. If you look closely at pictures of those places, what you're going to see is that throughout that area, you almost have fjords like you would see in Norway. You have narrow strips of land that can be farmed, narrow strips of land that go between the sea and mountains. As you approach any place in Greece from the sea, the mountains tower up above. Even on the islands, the elevation rises quickly from the sea. So there's always just a little strip of land where you can build cities and where you can set up farms. And so from very early on, Greeks were always sending out groups of colonists to go other places. Always there were people who had lost home. You might think of the Voyager Star Trek series, always trying to get home, and that sense of loss. Well, that's kind of the sense of loss that you see, I think, in many Greek poets. There's always something that is a little bit out of reach, that is a consciousness that there was something we had before, and now it's gone, and we wish we had it. That sense of loss we're going to talk about more a little bit later. What I want to turn to now is laying out who the key poets of that archaic period are. Most of us know about Homer, but I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Homer in a minute. Homer is the earliest of the written down Greek works that we have after, as I said, after the Greeks rediscovered how to write down their language. So we'll come back to Homer in a minute. In addition to Homer, the next one, early 7th century. Homer is late 8th century. Early 7th century, we have Hesiod. And Hesiod writes a little bit of mythology and a lot of practical information about farming and things like that, but all in poetry. Then in the mid to late 7th century, we have a poet named Archilochus that we have a lot preserved from. And in the late 7th, early 6th century, two poets named Alcaios and Sappho. We actually have about half a dozen poets from that period, but only small fragments from most of them. And the three most significant are certainly Archilochus and Alcaios and Sappho. Let's talk about Homer. You may already be familiar with the two works that we ascribe to a poet named Homer. The first is the Iliad, and the second is the Odyssey. The Iliad is a war poem, and we could debate whether it is a pro-war poem that elevates the glory of the warrior, or whether it's an anti-war poem that that highlights, again, that sense of loss, the sense that maybe things aren't as much worth fighting for as those heroes in the poem think. But what we know for sure about the Iliad is that it is not the composition of one man. It is about a war that for a long time we thought was completely mythological. Today we think it actually did happen, and that it was right around 1100 BCE, right there at the end of Mycenaean culture. So the heroes of the Trojan War, of the heroes of the poem we call the Iliad, are the heroes at the very end of Mycenaean civilization, just as it was all going away. When Homer describes them as men who could do what 10 of our men today cannot, that's that sense of loss. The Iliad begins with the anger of one warrior and depicts the grave losses that come from that. And it ends with that warrior returning to battle and with a new set of grave losses. And it ends with the laments of the Trojan women, of the women who lost their men as their city fell, as their civilization went away. And that lament, that's the closing idea of the Iliad. The Iliad, though, is composed of many little short stories. You could think of the whole story of the Anger of Achilles, that warrior whose story begins the Iliad, as being one thing that a guy might tell at a bar on a Friday night. He starts in and he tells in poetry, sings maybe the story of Achilles' anger and how it came about. Or another night, maybe the guy at the bar sings the story of Achilles and Patroclus' friendship. Or maybe he sings the story of Patroclus begging for Achilles' armor and going out and fighting the Trojans unwisely and what happens as a result of that. You might think of each of those laments at the end as a set piece that perhaps someone tells at a bar a different night. All of these things are part of an oral tradition of poetry that developed throughout that period of the Dark Ages. You might think of traveling bards in the French and British traditions later on, who went from place to place with their long songs and long stories. Well, Greek bards are kind of like that. And when someone finally writes down the Iliad, we call him Homer. And he does it by pasting together many of these sections of oral tradition to make a sort of a unified story. It's not all that unified, to tell the truth. There's lots of things pasted into it that you wonder why they're there. But they're parts of the tradition that this particular writer, whom we call Homer, had collected and put together to make one work when the magic of being able to write it all down came about. The second book that we attribute to Homer is called the Odyssey. And the Odyssey is a completely different work than the Iliad, different in many ways. And the fact that we attribute them both to Homer is almost accidental. They're certainly not written down by the same person, but they are connected. The Odyssey is the story of someone who was there at the Trojan War, who's featured in the Iliad often. His name is Odysseus. But the Odyssey is the story of his return home and how that comes about. Again, it's the product of oral tradition. It is many little stories that got pasted together when the magic of writing allows it. But we see in the Odyssey much more an author's hand at work, an author crafting a consistent story that has a purpose. I'd like to share with you just a little bit of the beginning of the Odyssey. And let me just cut that part out. I'm going to find it here, just a moment. I have it on screen. The way that the Odyssey is written and the way that the Iliad is written, it's in a meter that is called dactylic hexameter. And the rhythm is something like bum, ba, ba, 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 bum, ba, ba. So 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4 and a 5 and a 6 and a. So you're going to hear that rhythm in the poem as I read a little bit of it in Greek. The Odyssey begins, Andra men nepe musa polutropon hos malapola plongthepe troie siron taliethron eperson. I'm going to try that again. Here we go. Andra men nepe musa polutropon hos malapola plongthepe troie siron taliethron eperson. So did you hear that kind of dun da da dun da da dun da? Well, that rhythm goes through the whole poem, through 24 chapters of about 1,000 lines each, or 500 to 1,000 lines each. And that rhythm carries the poet along. You can imagine him singing these songs for, a half an hour or an hour at a time and coming back the next night for a little bit more, or maybe 3 or 4 hours on a really good night. That those opening lines say, sing to me, muse. Sing to me of the man of many ways. And the word polutropon, many ways. Polutropon is a really unusual word. It only occurs a couple of times in ancient Greek. And so Homer, or the oral source he is writing down, makes up that word, polutropon. Many ways. Odysseus is a man of many ways, in part because on his return, he's traveling home by many ways. He goes many places. He doesn't get straight home. It's a twisting path. But he's also a man of many ways because his prime character feature is that he's deceptive. At one point, Athena, the goddess who best supports Odysseus and who loves him best, says, I love you, Odysseus, because you just can't tell a straight story. I love you because you lie all the time. And that's the way Odysseus is. So he's the man of many ways. And the Homer who's writing the Odyssey loves him for that too, puts it in the very first line. That's what he loves about Odysseus, is that Odysseus tells stories. Fundamentally, the Odyssey is on one level about a man going home slowly after a long time away, and how that comes about. Think back on what you know about Greeks and loss and being far from home. On the other level, it's about a man who represents a people who love stories. And that's what the Odyssey is. Homer, remember, not the same person. Homer, we credit 2 epic poems, both in that same da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da meter. The Iliad, a war poem patched together from oral sources, and the Odyssey, a poem of return that is full of fantastical stories, full of things that you can believe or not believe, and you never know whether you're supposed to believe them or not, full of the ways of a very particular individual. And it's a book crafted, certainly, by one author whom we can call Homer, for lack of a better name. So Homer, his work gets written down at the very dawn of Greeks writing again their language with a new alphabet, with a Phoenician alphabet. Soon after Homer, the next poet that we have, a lot written by, is a guy named Hesiod. Hesiod is much more an individual. We do believe there is a guy named Hesiod, and we could tell you about his family because he talks about his brother and he talks about his neighbors and he criticizes them a lot. He writes about two things. We have two books by him. We have a book by him called The Theogony, where he attempts to explain where the gods came from. And we have by him a book called The Works and Days, which has the gods incidentally, but it mainly is sort of a calendar of how you ought to run your farm. Both in the same meter that Homer wrote in, that dum-ba-da-dum, da-da-dum, da-da kind of meter, but quite different language from what Homer wrote. One of the things, though, that Hesiod wrote about is the 5 ages of man, where he explains to his readers how it is that people today just aren't nearly as good as the ones who came before us. Do you remember that theme from Homer of the heroes who existed at the end of Mycenaean civilization? And of course, from Homer's perspective, who might be mythological, right? They're people who are long before us and different from us. Hesiod writes about the 5 ages of man. I'm going to grab a book for that, just a moment. So Hesiod says there were 5 ages of man, and the very first one, he says, were the golden age of people. He says, at first the immortals who dwell on Olympus created a golden race of mortal men. That was when Kronos was king of the sky. And they, those people, lived like gods, carefree in their hearts, shielded from pain and misery. Helpless old age did not exist. And with limbs of unsagging vigor, they enjoyed the delights of feasts out of evil's reach. So that's that first age in Hesiod's view, when everything was wonderful. There was no war, nothing bad. But then he says the earth covered this race, and they became holy spirits that haunt it, like that sense of the immanence that you get in the woods and the streams, that there's someone that was there before you. Those are the people of the Golden Age, to Hesiod. And he says then the gods of Olympus made a second race, a much worse one, this time of silver, unlike the golden in thought or looks. For 100 years they were nurtured by their prudent mothers as playful children, each a big baby in his house. But when they grew up and reached adolescence, they lived only for a short while, plagued by the pains of foolishness. They could not refrain from reckless violence against one another and did not want to worship the gods. And in time, Zeus, son of Kronos, was angered and buried them because they denied the Olympiads their blessed honors. So remember, Golden Age, everything is perfect, but they pass away. Silver Age, no sense of responsibility, and eventually the gods do away with them. And then Hesiod says, Zeus the father made a third race of mortals, this time of bronze, not at all like the silver one. Fashioned from ash trees, they were dreadful and mighty and bent on the harsh deeds of war and violence. They ate no bread, and their hearts were strong as steel. No one could come near them, for their strength was great, and mighty arms grew from the shoulders of their sturdy bodies. Bronze were their weapons, bronze their homes, and bronze was what they worked. There was no black iron then. With their hands they worked one another's destruction, and they reached the dank home of cold Hades, nameless. And Hesiod here arguably could be describing the same people that Homer describes, because that period, the warfare at the end of 11th century was using bronze arms, and arguably Hesiod may be talking about that same level of society. But then he says, but when the earth covered this race, Zeus, son of Cronos, made upon the nourishing land yet another race, the fourth one, better and more just. They were the divine race of heroes, who are called demigods. And remember, the ones who were the Bronze Age, they go to Hades nameless. The difference between them and the heroes use the same kind of weaponry and much of the same kind of warfare that the Bronze guys used, but the heroes don't go to Hades nameless. They are mighty individuals, and their names get recorded by Homer. And then finally, after all of those, comes the fifth race of men, according to Hesiod. And he says, I wish, now we get his personal voice, I wish I were not part of the fifth race of men, but rather had died before, been born after it. This, now, is the race of iron. Neither day nor night will give them rest, as they waste away with toil and pain. Growing cares will be given them by the gods, and their lot will be a blend of good and bad. So Hesiod tells this story of how human beings have gone from a very, very happy golden age long ago through the age of the heroes, the ones that are barely remembered by the Greeks from before the Dark Age, to his own age. And he sees his own age as not such a great time to be alive, a day of when everything is all work and no play, a mix of the good and the bad. So that's Hesiod. Writes about how to do that work with your iron plow in this age of iron, and how to watch the stars for the time of year, and how to get along with your neighbors who aren't working as hard as they should be, and all kinds of things like that. He is our source, by the way, for the early stories of Pandora, who's given to human beings. Her name means all gifts, and she's given ostensibly as a gift, but of course she's the first woman given by Zeus as a punishment for human beings. So that gives you a little sense of what Hesiod's point of view about life is. After Hesiod, then, those next three poets that I told you we would talk about today are Archilochus and Alcaios and Sappho.
Al-aithyllesta karaksuneltään nauisymplēai, tämän uijomais uide sympanteste teu, sedu kre tautanoistai.